What happens when the galaxy's most feared warrior meets humanity's greatest secret? In the grand arena of the Galactic Combat Championships, where species from across the cosmos prove their worth through ritualized combat, one human female is about to shatter every assumption about her kind. Commander Zethkar, legendary Krillian warrior who has never known defeat, believes humans are nothing more than soft, weapon-dependent weaklings. He's about to learn that the deadliest weapon in the universe isn't forged from metal or energy, it's evolution itself. When she raises her hand, the galaxy will never look at humanity the same way again. This is the story of how one moment of arrogance changed the course of galactic history, and why every alien species now whispers the same warning: never underestimate a human who stopped pretending to be harmless. The crystalline walls of the Grand Colosseum stretched toward the artificial sky, their surfaces alive with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in rhythm with the crowd's excitement. 50,000 beings from across the galaxy had gathered for the Tricentennial Combat Championships, their voices creating a symphony of anticipation that vibrated through the massive structure. The air itself seemed to shimmer with energy fields and the exotic atmospheres required by the various species in attendance. Commander Zethkar of the Krillian Empire stood at the edge of the competitor's balcony, his forearms crossed in a gesture of supreme confidence. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian, and the ceremonial scars across his thorax told the story of 3 decades of undefeated combat. Each mark represented a fallen opponent, a testament to his superiority in the ancient art of honorable warfare. The twin biocannons mounted on his shoulders hummed softly, their organic circuits charged and ready for demonstration. Below in the arena, the current match was reaching its conclusion. A Vorthak heavy fighter, standing nearly 4 meters tall and armed with plasma-edged warhammers, circled a smaller but incredibly fast Zilani speed warrior whose crystalline blades could cut through molecular bonds. The crowd roared as the 2 alien gladiators engaged in their ritualistic dance of death, each movement precise and deadly. This was how civilized species settled disputes and proved their worth, through skill, honor, and superior weaponry. Zethkar's mandibles clicked in approval as the Vorthak's hammer found its mark, sending crystalline fragments scattering across the arena floor. The Zilani warrior fell with grace, acknowledging defeat before the medical drones could reach him. This was proper combat, he thought. This was how warriors proved themselves worthy of respect in galactic society. "Impressive display," came a voice beside him. Zethkar turned one of his compound eyes toward the speaker, Ambassador Thelnox of the Hegemony Council, whose serpentine form was draped in the ceremonial robes of his office. The ambassador's translator collar glowed softly as it converted his hissing speech into universal standard. "Though I must say, Commander, the next exhibition promises to be far more entertaining." "Oh." Zethkar's voice was a deep rumble that seemed to emerge from his entire thorax. What primitive species has volunteered for humiliation this cycle? Thelnox's forked tongue flicked out in amusement. "The humans have requested participation in the open challenge rounds." The sound that emerged from Zethkar was somewhere between a laugh and a battle roar. Several nearby competitors turned to stare, their own conversations dying away. The idea was so absurd that it took him several seconds to process it fully. Humans, those soft pink creatures from the outer rim who had barely achieved faster-than-light travel, wanted to participate in the galaxy's most prestigious combat tournament? "Surely you jest," Zethkar said, his biocannons twitching with suppressed mirth. "The humans can barely lift their own primitive kinetic weapons, let alone compete against proper warriors. Have they brought some new mechanical exoskeleton? Some revolutionary energy weapon to compensate for their obvious physical inadequacies?" Ambassador Thelnox's scales rippled in what passed for a shrug among his people. "From what I understand, their representative has chosen to compete in the traditional manner, personal combat, no external weapons or technological augmentation beyond basic environmental protection." This time, Zethkar's laughter was genuine and loud enough to echo off the arena walls. "No weapons? No armor? No enhancement?" He slapped his secondary hands against his thorax in a gesture of pure incredulity. "These mammals truly have no concept of honor or reality. Do they expect to win through the power of positive thinking?" The conversation had drawn a small crowd of other competitors, each more amused than the last. A thoraxian berserker, his biomechanical implants glowing with stored fury, chittered in his native tongue before his translator converted it to standard speech. Perhaps they intend to bore their opponent to death with tales of their primitive achievements. Or maybe, added a Nexus warrior whose forearms ended in natural plasma projectors, they plan to overwhelm us with their famous human emotions that we've heard so much about. The group erupted in laughter, a cacophony of alien sounds that drew even more attention. Soon nearly half the competitors' section was engaged in speculation about the human surely doomed attempt at martial glory. Suggestions ranged from the absurd to the insulting, each new theory more ridiculous than the last. "I heard," said a Gakarian whose natural armor could deflect most energy weapons, "that humans become stronger when they're afraid. Perhaps they plan to frighten themselves into victory." "Impossible," Zethkar declared with authority. "I have studied their species extensively during the border negotiations. They are fragile creatures who require mechanical assistance for even basic tasks. Their bones break easily, their skin tears at the slightest provocation, and they become confused and disoriented when removed from their specific atmospheric requirements. Without their precious technology, they are nothing more than particularly large and inefficient prey animals." A new voice cut through the laughter like a molecular blade through flesh. "Is that what you really think?" The competitors turned as one to face the speaker. Standing at the entrance to their section was a human female, though she looked nothing like the diplomatic representatives most of them had encountered before. She was tall for her species, perhaps 1 3/4 meters, with dark hair pulled back in a simple functional style. Her clothing was the standard-issue environmental suit worn by all off-world visitors, but somehow it seemed to fit her differently than it fit the bureaucrats and traders who typically represented her kind. What was most striking about her was her posture. Unlike every other human the assembled warriors had ever encountered, she didn't seem small or intimidated by their presence. If anything, she appeared to be studying them with the same casual interest one might show when examining museum specimens. Her dark eyes moved from one alien fighter to another, taking in details of their natural weapons, their defensive capabilities, their apparent strengths and weaknesses. "Ah," Zethkar said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you must be the human representative. I was beginning to wonder if your species had come to its senses and withdrawn from this unfortunate venture." The human's lips curved in what he had learned was called a smile, though this one seemed somehow different from the nervous, placating expressions he was accustomed to seeing on human faces during diplomatic functions. This smile had edges. "Not at all," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet space. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen of the Terran Expeditionary Force, and I'm looking forward to the competition." "Lieutenant Commander?" Zethkar repeated, tasting the unfamiliar human rank structure. "I am Commander Zethkar, Paramount Champion of the Krillian Empire, and holder of 47 consecutive victories in formal combat. Tell me, little human, what experience do you have with real fighting? Not the mechanical button push in your species calls warfare, but actual combat where skill and physical prowess determine the victor?" Sarah's smile widened slightly. "Some." The simple response seemed to irritate several of the assembled warriors. They were accustomed to elaborate boasting, to detailed recitations of past victories, and descriptions of fearsome weaponry. The human's apparent lack of interest in proper warrior protocol was almost insulting. "Some," the Thoraxian berserker repeated, his mechanical implants sparking with agitation. "Human, do you understand what you have committed yourself to? This is not some primitive sport played for entertainment. Warriors have died in this arena. Species have lost their claims to expansion rights based on the outcome of these contests. And do you understand," Sarah replied calmly, "that your attitude is exactly why my superiors wanted me here?" Zethkar's compound eyes focused on her more intently. There was something in her tone that didn't match her species' reputation for conflict avoidance and submission to superior force. "Explain." "The Galactic Council has made it clear that humanity's standing in the galactic community depends largely on how we're perceived by the warrior cultures. Most of you seem to think we're weak because we prefer to use tools and technology rather than natural weapons. The diplomatic corps felt it was important to clarify some misconceptions." "Misconceptions?" The Nexus Warrior's plasma projectors began to glow with anticipation. "Human, we have seen your kind in person. We know exactly what you are capable of. Your bones are hollow like a bird's. Your skin is thinner than paper. You have no natural weapons, no protective armor, no enhanced strength or speed. You are quite literally the weakest sentient species to achieve spaceflight in recorded galactic history." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Those are interesting assumptions. Tell me, how many humans have you actually seen in combat?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Zethkar realized that none of them had ever witnessed a human in actual physical confrontation. Their knowledge of human capabilities came entirely from medical scans performed during first contact, diplomatic observations of carefully controlled meetings, and technical assessments of human military hardware. They knew humans were physically inferior because the evidence seemed so obvious. So overwhelming. We have seen enough, Zethkar said finally. Your own medical data confirms our assessments. Humans are fragile, dependent on technology, and completely unsuited for personal combat. Medical data, Sarah repeated, from examinations of diplomats, traders, and scientists. Non-combatants who have spent most of their lives in controlled environments with artificial gravity and engineered atmospheres. She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. Do you know what happens to a human body when it's subjected to the kind of physical stress that produces a soldier? Before anyone could answer, the arena's announcement system activated, filling the Colosseum with harmonic tones that indicated the next exhibition was about to begin. The competitors moved toward the viewing areas as the crowd below erupted in fresh excitement. It seems we're about to find out, Zethkar said, gesturing toward the arena floor, where preparation platforms were rising from beneath the crystalline surface. I trust you have made peace with whatever deities your species recognizes. Sarah was already walking toward the competitor preparation area, her stride confident and unhurried. Over her shoulder she called back, Commander Zethkar, you've spent so much time studying human weaknesses that you never thought to ask about human strengths. As she disappeared through the prep area entrance, Zethkar found himself oddly unsettled. There had been something in her voice, something in the way she moved, that didn't match his expectations. For just a moment, he wondered if perhaps there was more to this exhibition than simple entertainment value. Then he dismissed the thought. Humans were what they were, regardless of their individual confidence levels. In a few minutes, the galaxy would witness the inevitable result when primitive biology met superior evolutionary development. It would be educational, if somewhat tragic. The preparation platforms began to glow as the arena's systems activated. Soon, very soon, all doubts would be resolved through the ancient and honorable method of combat. Zethkar settled into his viewing position, already composing the report he would send back to the Krillian High Command about humanity's amusing but futile attempt at martial credibility. Below in the arena, the lights were beginning to dim as the exhibition prepared to commence. The crowd's excitement was building toward a crescendo, and across the galaxy, billions of beings were tuning in to watch what promised to be either a surprising upset or a demonstration of why humans would never be taken seriously as a warrior species. In the preparation chamber, Sarah Chen was removing her environmental suit and replacing it with the minimal protective gear required by arena regulations. As she secured the lightweight breathing apparatus that would allow her to survive in the arena's atmosphere, she thought about the conversation she just had with the assembled alien warriors. They really had no idea what they were about to witness. For all their superior technology and biological advantages, they had made the same mistake that every enemy humanity had ever faced eventually made. They had assumed that because humans looked weak, because they preferred to use tools and tactics rather than brute force, they actually were weak. Sarah flexed her hands, feeling the familiar tension in muscles that had been shaped by years of training in variable gravity, enhanced atmospheric pressure, and combat conditions that would kill most baseline humans. The assembled aliens thought they knew what human physiology was capable of because they had scanned diplomats and civilians. They were about to learn the difference between a human and a human soldier. The preparation chamber's announcement system crackled to life, informing her that the exhibition would begin in 60 seconds. Sarah took a slow, deep breath and began the mental preparation routine that had been drilled into her since basic training. Her heart rate slowed, her breathing became more efficient, and her perception sharpened as her body shifted into combat mode. Above in the viewing areas, Zethkar was discussing potential betting odds with his fellow competitors when the arena lights suddenly blazed to full intensity. The crowd's roar reached a deafening crescendo as the exhibition platforms rose into position. On one side stood the human female, looking impossibly small and fragile under the harsh arena lighting. She wore only the minimum protective gear required by regulations, a breathing apparatus and a simple bodysuit that would prevent atmospheric exposure without providing any physical protection or enhancement. On the opposite platform stood her opponent for the demonstration, a Kresh warrior whose natural armor looked like living metal and whose forearms ended in bone blades that could cut through starship hull material. The Kresh stood nearly 3 meters tall and massed easily 4 times what the human did. It was, everyone agreed, a perfectly fair match by galactic standards, since both competitors were fighting without technological enhancement. This will be over in seconds, someone said behind Zethkar. Perhaps we should ask for a different demonstration, another voice suggested. This seems less like combat and more like an execution. Zethkar found himself studying the human more carefully. From this distance, it was difficult to make out details, but something about her posture still seemed wrong. She didn't look afraid, which made no sense. She should be terrified. Any rational being would be terrified when faced with a Kresh warrior in personal combat. The arena's ceremonial gong sounded 3 times, and the exhibition began. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed by xenobiologists, military strategists, and philosophers for decades to come. But in that moment, as Sarah Chen raised her hand toward her opponent, Zethkar finally understood why the human diplomatic corps had been so insistent that their species deserved a higher threat classification. Humans, it turned out, had been hiding something important from the galaxy, something that changed everything. The ceremonial gong's final echo died away into absolute silence. 50,000 beings held their breath as the exhibition officially began, but neither combatant moved immediately. The Kresh warrior, designated as Thrakmor the Destroyer, stood in the traditional starting pose of his people, arms spread wide to display his natural weapons, armored head tilted in challenge, his metallic carapace reflecting the arena lights like a living mirror. Across the circular combat zone, Sarah Chen remained perfectly still. To the observers in the stands, she looked almost meditative, her dark eyes fixed on her opponent with an intensity that seemed strangely calm for someone facing certain death. Her breathing was controlled, steady, showing none of the rapid panic responses that most species exhibited when confronted with mortal danger. Zethkar leaned forward in his seat, his compound eyes tracking every minute detail of the scene below. Something was bothering him about the human's behavior, though he couldn't quite identify what. She should have been moving by now, desperately trying to use her superior speed to avoid the Kresh's inevitable charge. Instead, she stood as still as a statue, apparently studying her opponent with scientific detachment. "What is she waiting for?" muttered the Thoraxian berserker beside him. "Does she not understand that the contest has begun?" Ambassador Thalnix's translator collar flickered as he replied, "Perhaps fear has paralyzed her." It would not be unprecedented for a prey species to freeze when confronted by a natural predator. But Zethkar was beginning to think it wasn't fear at all. There was something about the human stillness that reminded him of the moments before a predator struck, when every muscle was coiled and ready but waiting for the perfect moment to unleash violence. The comparison was absurd. Humans were clearly not predators, but the nagging feeling persisted. In the arena, Thrakmor's patience finally ran out. With a roar that shook the crystalline walls, he launched himself forward in the traditional Kresh battle charge. His 4-blade arms swept in a complex pattern designed to provide multiple attack angles while maintaining defensive coverage, a technique that had served his species well in thousands of years of warfare. His metallic feet thundered against the arena floor as he crossed the distance between himself and his prey. Sarah Chen raised her hand. It was such a simple gesture that many observers almost missed it. No dramatic flourishes, no battle cries, no desperate last-minute scrambling for position. She simply lifted her right hand, palm facing outward, fingers slightly spread. To most of the audience, it looked like a gesture of surrender, a final acknowledgement of defeat before the inevitable conclusion. Thrakmor saw the raised hand and interpreted it as exactly that, submission. His roar took on a note of satisfaction as he adjusted his attack pattern to deliver a quick, honorable killing blow rather than the prolonged dismemberment that was traditional when facing a worthy opponent. The human had shown wisdom in acknowledging her inferiority, and he would grant her the mercy of a swift death. His leading blade arms swept down in a perfect arc, aimed at the human's exposed neck. The movement was so fast that most observers couldn't follow it with their naked eyes. A blur of living metal that should have ended the exhibition in a spray of red blood and the dull thud of a falling body. Instead, the blade stopped. For a moment, nobody understood what they were seeing. Thrakmor's blade arm had simply frozen in mid-strike, as if time itself had stopped. The massive warrior's forward momentum carried him past his intended target, and he stumbled, confused by the unexpected resistance he had encountered. Then the audience saw what had happened, and a collective gasp rose from 50,000 throats. The human female had caught the blade. Her small, soft-looking hand was wrapped around Thrakmor's forearm, just below the bone blade. And the Kresh warrior's most powerful strike had been stopped as effectively as if it had hit a starship's hull. The blade itself, which could cut through military-grade armor, was less than a centimeter from the human's throat, but it might as well have been a kilometer away. Thrakmor stared down at his captured arm in disbelief. He was a Kresh warrior, bred for combat over thousands of generations. His natural strength was sufficient to tear apart most mechanical systems. His bone blades had never been stopped by anything less than powered armor or energy shields. The idea that a soft, unarmored creature could simply grab his arm and hold it motionless was beyond his understanding. He tried to pull back, putting his full strength into the movement. The human's grip didn't budge. If anything, her fingers seemed to tighten slightly, and he felt something that no Kresh warrior should ever feel, his own bones beginning to bend under pressure. "Impossible," Zethkar breathed, his translator barely picking up the whispered word. Around him, the other competitors had fallen silent, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. Sarah Chen's voice carried clearly across the arena, though she hadn't raised it above a conversational level. "You know what the problem is with assumptions?" she asked Thrakmor, who was now frantically trying to bring his other three arms into play. "They make you stop looking for information that might contradict what you think you already know." The Kresh warrior's second blade swept toward the human's midsection in a horizontal slice that should have cut her in half. Sarah's free hand moved in a blur of motion, catching the second blade with the same casual ease she had shown with the first. Now 2 of Thrakmor's forearms were completely immobilized, held fast by grips that seemed impossibly strong for such small hands. "For instance," Sarah continued, still speaking in that same calm conversational tone, "your intelligence files probably told you that human bone density is relatively low compared to most galactic species. That's true for baseline humans living in controlled environments. But do you know what happens to bone density when a human grows up in higher gravity?" Thrakmor's third arm stabbed toward the human's back in a desperate attempt to break the stalemate. Without even looking, Sarah shifted her weight and twisted her torso, causing the blade to pass harmlessly past her. In the same motion, she somehow managed to trap the third arm against her side, pinning it with nothing more than the pressure of her elbow. "Or what happens," she continued, "when that same human spends years training in variable gravity fields, sometimes fighting in conditions that would crush most baseline members of her species? The human body is remarkably adaptable, you know, much more so than most species realize." The crowd was completely silent now, watching in stunned fascination as a creature they had dismissed as harmless systematically neutralized one of the galaxy's most feared warrior types. Thrakmor still had one arm free, but he seemed almost afraid to use it, as if he was beginning to understand that he was facing something far outside his experience. Up in the viewing areas, Ambassador Thonox was frantically accessing files on his personal datapad. "Commander," he said to Zethkar, his voice tight with concern, "I am reviewing the human medical data we received during first contact. Something is irregular." "What do you mean, irregular?" Zethkar demanded, never taking his eyes off the scene below. "The physiological scans we were provided show beings with bone density approximately 60% of galactic baseline, muscle fiber efficiency rated at 43% of standard, and cardiovascular systems that would be considered weak even by herbivore standards." "Then explain what we're seeing." Thelmix's scales rippled with agitation. "I cannot. According to our data, what that human is doing should be physically impossible. She should not be able to restrain a Kresh warrior any more than a hatchling could restrain a battlecruiser." In the arena, Sarah had begun to move. Still maintaining her grip on Thrakmor's 3 captured arms, she stepped to one side and somehow twisted her body in a way that forced the massive warrior off balance. He stumbled, tried to compensate, and found himself being guided inexorably toward the arena wall by forces he couldn't understand or counter. "The thing is," Sarah said, her voice now carrying a note of something that might have been amusement, "those medical scans you're all so fond of citing, they weren't taken from soldiers. They were taken from diplomats, traders, scientists, and civilians. People whose bodies had been shaped by comfortable lives in artificial environments with carefully controlled conditions." With a movement too fast for most observers to follow, Sarah suddenly released all 3 of Thrakmor's arms and stepped back. The Kresh warrior, who had been straining against her grip with all his considerable strength, was thrown completely off balance by the sudden lack of resistance. He crashed into the arena wall with a sound like thunder, his metallic carapace ringing like a struck bell. "Do you want to know what a real human looks like?" Sarah asked as Thrakmor struggled to regain his footing. "What we're capable of when we're not pretending to be harmless." Thrakmor roared and charged again, this time abandoning all technique in favor of pure berserker fury. All 4 of his blade arms swept toward the human in a whirlwind of cutting edges that should have reduced her to component atoms. Sarah Chen smiled, and for the first time, the watching alien saw her as she truly was. Her movement was liquid, flowing like water around obstacles. She didn't block Thrakmor's attacks. She simply wasn't where they expected her to be. The Kresh warrior's blades cut through empty air as the human seemed to dance between them, always a fraction of a second ahead of the killing strikes. Her footwork was precise, economical, each step calculated to maximum effect with minimum effort. But it wasn't just evasion. As Thrakmor's momentum carried him past her, Sarah's hand shot out and struck him in the center of his back. The blow looked almost gentle, barely more than a tap, but the sound it made was like a gunshot. Thrackmore stumbled, his charge faltering as something went wrong with his nervous system. Human combat doctrine, Sarah explained as she circled the increasingly disoriented warrior, is based on the principle that any opponent can be defeated if you can identify the right pressure points, leverage points, and structural weaknesses. We don't rely on natural weapons because we learn to make any part of our body into a weapon. She demonstrated by striking Throckmore again, this time at the base of his skull where his armored carapace met his neck. The tap was even lighter than the first, but the massive warrior's legs suddenly gave out, dumping him onto the arena floor in an undignified heap. We don't rely on natural armor, Sarah continued, because we learn to not be where the attacks are aimed. And we don't rely on superior strength because we learned that applied properly, a few pounds of force in exactly the right place can stop a few tons of force applied incorrectly. But Thrackmore tried to rise, his natural healing systems already working to repair whatever damage the human had inflicted. But Sarah was suddenly behind him, her arm wrapped around his throat in what looked like a gentle embrace, but the pressure she applied to specific points on his neck caused his vision to blur and his strength to drain away like water. "The medical scans you based your assumptions on," she said softly, her words somehow carrying clearly throughout the silent arena, "showed you baseline humans, civilians, people who had never been forced to push their bodies beyond normal limits." She increased the pressure slightly, and Throckmore's struggles grew weaker. "But humans are persistence hunters, Commander Zethkar. Do you know what that means?" Her voice had taken on a different quality, something that sent chills through the assembled observers. "It means we evolved to chase our prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. It means our bodies are designed to keep going long after any sane creature would give up. It means we don't stop." Thrackmore made one last desperate attempt to break free, bringing his blade arms up toward the human's position. Sarah shifted her grip minutely, and suddenly the crushed warrior's arms wouldn't obey his commands. The neural pathways that controlled his natural weapons had been temporarily severed by pressure applied to exactly the right nerve clusters. "And when we trained for combat," Sarah whispered, her words somehow audible to every being in the Colosseum, "we learned to push those limits even further. We learned to make our bodies into something that could survive conditions that would kill our ancestors. We learned to become the thing that other predators have nightmares about." The arena fell completely silent except for the sound of Thrackmore's labored breathing. The massive warrior was still alive, still conscious but completely helpless in the human's grip. His four-blade arms hung useless at his sides, his vaunted strength meaningless against techniques he had no defense for. "Do you yield?" Sarah asked quietly. Thrackmore's response was barely audible, but his translator collar picked it up and broadcast it throughout the arena. "I yield." Sarah released him immediately, stepping back as the crushed warrior collapsed to his hands and knees, his natural healing systems working frantically to restore normal function to his nervous system. The medical drones that monitored all arena combat reported that he would make a full recovery within hours, but the psychological damage might take considerably longer to heal. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah Chen stood alone in the center of the arena, barely breathing hard despite the physical exertion of defeating a warrior 3 times her size and mass. She looked up at the viewing areas where the alien competitors sat in stunned silence, her dark eyes finding Zethkar's position with uncanny accuracy. "Any other questions about human capabilities?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustic perfection of the arena. Zethkar found himself unable to respond. Everything he thought he knew about humans, about their limitations and weaknesses, had just been systematically destroyed by a single small female who had made defeating a crushed warrior look as easy as swatting an insect. The implications were staggering, not just for his own assumptions, but for the entire galactic community's understanding of what humanity represented. If this was what humans were capable of when they stopped pretending to be harmless, then perhaps the galaxy had seriously underestimated the new species from the Outer Rim. Perhaps the careful diplomatic approach humans had maintained since first contact wasn't a sign of weakness at all. Perhaps it was a sign of mercy. As the medical drones began their work on Thrackmore and Sarah Chen walked calmly toward the exit, Zethkar realized that his report to the Krillian High Command was going to require significant revision. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity's true strength had never been their technology. It had been their restraint. The aftermath of the exhibition sent shockwaves through the Grand Colosseum that had nothing to do with the acoustic systems. As Sarah Chen disappeared into the competitor preparation areas, 50,000 spectators sat in stunned silence trying to process what they had just witnessed. The impossible had happened. Not only had a human defeated a Kresh warrior in single combat, but she had done so with such casual efficiency that it looked almost effortless. Commander Zethkar remained frozen in his seat, his compound eyes still fixed on the arena floor, where Thrakmor was slowly recovering under the ministrations of the medical drones. The Kresh warriors' natural healing systems were remarkable, but even they couldn't instantly repair the psychological damage of being systematically dismantled by a creature he had considered prey. Each time Thrakmor tried to stand, his legs trembled with something that had nothing to do with physical injury. Around the competitors section, the conversations that had been so confident and dismissive just minutes earlier had died away completely. The Thoraxian berserker's biomechanical implants sparked occasionally as his augmented nervous system tried to reconcile what his sensors had recorded with what his brain insisted should be possible. The Nexus Warrior's plasma projectors had dimmed to almost nothing, their organic circuits apparently as shocked as their owner. Ambassador Thelnox was frantically scrolling through files on his personal datapad, his forked tongue flicking in and out with increasing agitation. "This makes no sense," he muttered, his translator caller struggling to convey the complex emotions in his voice. "According to every piece of data we have on human physiology, what we just witnessed is impossible." "Perhaps," suggested the Gakarian, whose natural armor had suddenly seemed less impressive, "our data is incomplete." "Incomplete?" Galanox's scales rippled with agitation. "We conducted comprehensive medical examinations during first contact. We scanned hundreds of humans across multiple encounters. The readings were consistent. Low bone density, inefficient muscle structure, poor cardiovascular performance, minimal natural weapons or defenses. By every objective measure, humans should be among the weakest sentient species in the galaxy." Zethkar finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "Then we've been measuring the wrong humans." The simple statement hung in the air like a revelation. Slowly, pieces began to fall into place as the assembled warriors reconsidered everything they thought they knew about the newest members of the galactic community. The humans who had represented their species during first contact, the diplomats and scientists and traders who had served as the galaxy's primary source of information about human capabilities, they weren't soldiers.
"By the 7 moons breathed the Vorthak heavy fighter who had won the previous exhibition.
We've been judging their entire species based on their civilians. It was a mistake so fundamental, so basic, that it seemed almost impossible that every major intelligence service in the galaxy had made it simultaneously. But the evidence was now undeniable. Somehow, humanity had managed to keep their true military capabilities hidden, while maintaining the appearance of a weak, technology-dependent species that posed no threat to galactic stability. The question was, why? Down in the arena, the medical drones had finished their assessment of Thrakmor and were helping the Kresh warrior to his feet. His physical condition was listed as stable, with no permanent damage, but the psychological evaluation flags in his file were extensive. The drone's sensors had detected stress indicators consistent with profound trauma, the kind usually associated with prey species who had survived predator attacks. The irony was not lost on the assembled observers. A member of one of the galaxy's premier warrior races had been psychologically broken by a human female who weighed less than one of his arms. As if summoned by the collective realization that they needed answers, Sarah Chen reappeared from the preparation areas. She had changed back into her environmental suit, though somehow it seemed to fit her differently now. Where before she had looked like just another human diplomat trying to navigate an alien environment, now she moved with the controlled grace of a predator who was simply choosing not to hunt. She made her way to the competitors section without apparent hurry, though several of the assembled warriors instinctively shifted away from her as she approached. The casual way she had dismantled Thrakmor had demonstrated that her small size was no indication of her actual threat level, and most predators preferred to maintain safe distances from unknown dangers.
"Commander Zethkar," she said as she approached his position.
Her voice was pleasant, conversational, showing no sign of the controlled violence she had displayed just minutes earlier. "I believe you had some questions about human capabilities." Zethkar studied her carefully, his compound eyes taking in details he had missed during their earlier conversation. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see the signs that should have been obvious from the beginning. Her muscle tone was different from the soft, atrophied look of humans who lived sedentary lives in controlled environments. Her posture spoke of constant readiness, of a body trained to react instantly to threats. Even her breathing patterns were wrong, too controlled, too efficient, like someone who had learned to function in hostile environments where every breath might be her last. "You've been hiding," he said finally. "Your entire species has been hiding what you're really capable of." Sarah's smile was enigmatic. "Have we, Or have you been making assumptions based on limited data? Don't play word games with me, human. Zethkar's biocannons twitched with agitation. What we just witnessed was not the result of natural human evolution. That kind of combat capability requires training, conditioning, genetic optimization. Your diplomatic representatives showed no signs of such enhancement. Because they weren't enhanced, Sarah replied simply. They were exactly what they appeared to be. Diplomats, scientists, and traders who had lived comfortable lives in artificial environments. The mistake you made was assuming that all humans are the same. Ambassador Thelnox slithered closer, his datapad clutched in his manipulator appendages. Are you claiming that there are significant physiological differences between human civilians and human military personnel?
Not physiological differences, Sarah corrected.
Developmental differences. The human body is remarkably plastic, especially during the growth years. A human raised in high gravity will develop stronger bones and more efficient muscle structures than one raised in standard conditions. A human trained from childhood in combat disciplines will develop neurological pathways and reflexes that a civilian could never achieve. She gestured toward the arena where Thrakmor was still being examined by the medical teams. What you saw down there wasn't superhuman ability. It was simply human ability developed to its natural potential under optimal conditions. Natural potential? The Thoraxian berserker's implants sparked more violently. No natural species develops combat reflexes that precise without artificial enhancement. Sarah's expression grew more serious. That's where you're wrong. Humans are persistence hunters, Commander. We evolved to chase prey across vast distances until it collapsed from exhaustion. But we're also pursuit predators, which means we had to be able to bring down animals much larger and stronger than ourselves once we caught them. She began to pace slowly, her movements unconsciously falling into the flowing gait that had made her so difficult to target in the arena. Do you know how a persistence hunter kills a creature 3 times its size? Not with brute force, that would be suicide. We developed techniques, strategies, ways of applying leverage and pressure that could disable much larger opponents. We learned to read body language, to predict movement patterns, to identify structural weaknesses in anatomy we'd never encountered before. But that was primitive hunting behavior, protested the Nexus warrior. Surely such instincts would have been bred out during the development of civilization. Would they? Sarah's smile was sharp. Humans have been fighting wars for our entire recorded history. Not just territorial disputes or resource conflicts, total wars where the survival of entire populations depended on our ability to outfight, outthink, and outlast our enemies. Every generation has produced soldiers, warriors, protectors who pushed the boundaries of what human combat capability could achieve. She stopped pacing and fixed Zethkar with a direct stare. You assumed that because we prefer to use technology in warfare, we're dependent on it. But human military doctrine has always emphasized adaptability. We use technology because it's more efficient than hand-to-hand combat, not because we're incapable of fighting without it. The implications were staggering. If humans had maintained and developed their natural combat abilities throughout their technological advancement, then they represented something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that had achieved interstellar capability without sacrificing the predatory instincts that had made them dangerous in the first place. But your diplomatic policy, Telmec said desperately, consulting his files again. Humans have consistently avoided confrontation, preferred negotiation over force, submitted to galactic authority in every dispute. This is not the behavior of a warrior species. No, Sarah agreed. It's the behavior of a species that understands exactly how dangerous it is. The silence that followed was profound. Around them, the arena was emptying as the regular combat exhibitions resumed. But none of the competitors moved from their positions. They were too focused on the conversation, too stunned by the revelations being casually dropped by the small human female who had just redefined their understanding of the galactic power balance. You've been restraining yourselves, Zethkar said slowly, deliberately appearing weak to avoid conflict. We've been responsible, Sarah corrected. When we first achieved faster-than-light travel and encountered the galactic community, we realized we had a choice. We could reveal our full capabilities and likely trigger a preemptive war as various species tried to eliminate what they perceived as a threat, or we could demonstrate that we preferred peace and cooperation. She shrugged, a purely human gesture that somehow conveyed volumes about her species' attitude toward violence.
We chose peace.
But that doesn't mean we forgot how to fight. How many of you are there? The Gikarian asked quietly. How many humans like you? Like me specifically? Not many. I'm part of an elite unit trained for exactly this kind of demonstration. But humans with basic combat training? Sarah's smile was not entirely reassuring. Most of our population receives at least fundamental military instruction during their education. Universal service isn't mandatory, but it's common. We've learned from our history that peaceful societies survive longer when they're capable of defending themselves. The numbers were starting to add up in ways that made several of the listening warriors distinctly uncomfortable. If even a fraction of humanity's population possessed combat capabilities comparable to what they had just witnessed, then the humans represented a military force unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. An entire species of potential soldiers disguised as peaceful civilians. This changes everything, Ambassador Thalnex whispered, his scales pale with shock. The threat assessments, the territorial negotiations, the resource allocation agreements, they were all based on the assumption that humans were a minor player in galactic affairs. And now? Sarah asked mildly. Now we realize that we've been negotiating with a species that could probably conquer half the galaxy if they chose to. Sarah's laughter was genuinely amused. Commander Thelnox, you still don't understand. We don't want to conquer anyone. Conquest is expensive, inefficient, and ultimately counterproductive. Why would we waste resources fighting you when we can trade with you instead? But you could, Zethkar pressed. If you wanted to, you could. If we wanted to, Sarah agreed. But we don't. That's what you need to understand about humans. We're not aggressive because we can afford to be peaceful. We're secure enough in our own capabilities that we don't need to prove them through conquest. The distinction was subtle, but profound. A weak species that preached peace might simply be making a virtue of necessity. A strong species that chose peace despite having other options was something else entirely, something that commanded a different kind of respect. What happens now? The Vorthak heavy fighter asked. Do we pretend this exhibition never happened? Do we maintain the fiction that humans are weak and harmless? That's up to you, Sarah replied. We've been content to let people underestimate us because it makes diplomacy easier. But recent events have suggested that our cautious approach might be creating more problems than it solves. What kind of problems? Sarah's expression grew more serious. The kind where aggressive species decide to test what they think are our limits. The kind where territorial disputes escalate because people assume we'll back down rather than fight. The kind where someone makes the mistake of thinking that human restraint is the same thing as human weakness. The implication hung in the air like a threat that wasn't quite a threat. Humanity had been playing a careful game, maintaining peace through perceived weakness, but that strategy only worked as long as nobody pushed too hard. If the galactic community had begun to interpret human diplomacy as cowardice rather than choice, then perhaps it was time for a demonstration of what choice really meant. So this exhibition, Zethkar said slowly, was a message. A clarification, Sarah corrected. A reminder that human diplomatic policy is based on preference, not capability. We choose peace because we value it, not because we can't choose war. She looked around at the assembled warriors, her dark eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. The question you all need to ask yourselves is, knowing what you know now, do you want to continue the careful, respectful, diplomatic relationship we've been building? Or do you want to test whether human patience has limits? The question didn't require an answer, at least not immediately. But as Sarah Chen walked away, leaving the competitors to contemplate the implications of what they had learned, it was clear that the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in ways that would take time to fully understand. Humanity was no longer the weak, harmless species that could be safely ignored or dismissed. They were something much more dangerous. A species that had chosen to be peaceful while retaining the capability to be otherwise. And that changed everything. The news of the arena exhibition spread across the galaxy faster than the most advanced communication networks could carry it. Within hours, encrypted military channels were buzzing with urgent requests for intelligence updates, while civilian networks carried wildly exaggerated accounts of the human female who had supposedly destroyed an entire Kresh battle unit with her bare hands. The truth, as Sarah Chen had demonstrated, was dramatic enough without embellishment, but that didn't stop the stories from growing with each retelling. On the Krillian homeworld of Zethkrath, Supreme Battle Commander Thexnor received Zethkar's preliminary report while reviewing territorial expansion plans that had assumed human space would offer minimal resistance to annexation. The document that appeared on his bio display was so different from the expected assessment that he initially dismissed it as some kind of elaborate prank. Only after reviewing the arena's official recordings did he begin to understand that his empire's strategic planning required immediate and fundamental revision. Similar scenes were playing out across dozens of worlds as intelligence services scrambled to reassess everything they thought they knew about humanity's military capabilities. The careful assumptions that had guided galactic policy for decades were crumbling under the weight of a single exhibition match, and the implications were staggering. But nowhere were the revelations having a more immediate impact than aboard the diplomatic vessel Concordant Truth, where Ambassador Veltar of the Hegemony Council was frantically preparing for an emergency session with the human diplomatic delegation. The ambassador's four-chambered brain was working at maximum capacity, trying to process the political ramifications of what had just been revealed about their newest galactic neighbors. The human delegation's quarters aboard the Concordant Truth had been designed according to the standard assumptions about human environmental needs, comfortable but not luxurious, sized for beings of relatively modest physical capabilities, equipped with the technological assistance that humans supposedly required for basic functions. Now, as Ambassador Veltar approached the meeting chamber, he found himself wondering how many other assumptions about human limitations were about to prove equally false. The door to the human quarters dilated open at his approach, and he entered to find 3 humans waiting for him. Ambassador Patricia Kim, the chief diplomatic representative, sat at the central conference table with her usual calm professionalism. Beside her sat Dr. Marcus Webb, the cultural attaché whose expertise in xenosociology had made him invaluable during first contact protocols. And across from them, looking remarkably composed for someone who had just redefined interspecies relations, was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen. Ambassador Veltar, Patricia Kim said, rising to greet him with a respectful gesture that humans used for formal occasions. Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice. Veltar's translator collar flickered as it converted his complex harmonic speech into human auditory ranges. Ambassador Kim, I confess that recent events have raised questions that require urgent clarification. The exhibition this afternoon has altered certain perceptions about human capabilities.
I imagine it has, Dr.
Webb said dryly. Sarah's demonstration was quite effective, though perhaps more dramatic than we had originally planned. More dramatic? Veltar's chromatophore patches shifted to display patterns of confusion and concern. Ambassador, what we witnessed was a human female defeating a Kresh warrior in single combat using techniques that our analysts describe as impossible according to known human physiology. How is this merely dramatic rather than revolutionary? Sarah Chen spoke for the first time since his arrival, her voice carrying the same calm confidence she had displayed in the arena. Because what you saw wasn't superhuman, Ambassador Veltar. It was simply human potential, developed under optimal conditions. Your analysts made their assessments based on baseline human physiology, not trained human physiology. Trained how extensively? Veltar asked, settling into one of the adjustable seats that accommodated his arthropod body structure. What percentage of your population possesses combat capabilities comparable to what we observed? The 3 humans exchanged glances that seemed to carry complex layers of communication. Finally, Ambassador Kim leaned forward and activated her personal data pad. That's a complicated question, Ambassador. Perhaps it would be helpful if we provided some context about human society and our approach to defense. The holographic display that materialized above the conference table showed a 3-dimensional representation of human space, with trade routes, colonies, and military installations marked in different colors. But what immediately caught Veltar's attention was the scale. The human sphere of influence was significantly larger than their official territorial claims indicated. You've been expanding, he said, his chromatophore patches shifting to aggressive orange patterns. We've been exploring, Dr. Webb corrected. There's a difference. Unlike most species, humans don't establish territorial claims until we've thoroughly surveyed and analyzed a region. What you're seeing are survey operations, research stations, and monitoring posts, not military installations or colonial outposts. Though, Sarah added with a slight smile, our research stations are quite capable of defending themselves if necessary. Ambassador Veltar studied the display more carefully, noting details that had been absent from previous human territorial reports. The network of installations formed a defensive perimeter that could monitor and potentially control access to a vast region of space. If those installations were staffed by humans with capabilities similar to what Sarah had demonstrated, they represented a military presence far more significant than anyone had realized. How many humans are trained for combat? He asked directly. All of them, Ambassador Kim replied simply. The translator caller's processing system struggled with the concept for several seconds before producing an audible output. I'm sorry, could you clarify that response? All humans receive basic combat training, Dr. Webb explained. It's part of our standard education system. Physical fitness, situational awareness, basic self-defense techniques, emergency response protocols. Every human child learns these skills alongside mathematics and language arts. But surely not all humans maintain those skills to the level demonstrated by Lieutenant Commander Chen.
No, Sarah agreed.
Most humans who choose civilian careers allow their combat skills to atrophy to some degree, but they retain the fundamental training and could reactivate those capabilities if necessary. It's rather like riding a bicycle. Once learned, the basic patterns remain. Veltar's brain struggled to process the implications. Are you suggesting that your entire population represents a potential military reserve?
Not potential, Ambassador Kim corrected gently. Actual.
In times of crisis, any adult human can serve in a combat role with minimal refresher training. It's one of the foundational principles of human society, the idea that freedom can only be maintained by people who are prepared to defend it themselves. The concept was so alien to most galactic civilizations that Veltar needed several minutes to fully comprehend it. Most species maintain distinct warrior and civilian castes, with military capabilities concentrated in specialized populations that made up a small percentage of the total society. The idea of an entire species trained for combat was unprecedented in galactic history. Your diplomatic behavior, he said slowly, your preference for negotiation over force, your willingness to accept unfavorable terms in territorial disputes, this was all strategic deception. Not deception, Ambassador Kim said firmly. Choice. We genuinely prefer peaceful solutions to conflict, but our willingness to pursue peaceful options doesn't stem from inability to choose otherwise. Sarah's expression grew more serious. Ambassador, humans have a saying, speak softly and carry a big stick. It means that diplomatic courtesy becomes more effective when backed by the capability to enforce your position if necessary. How big is the stick? Veltar asked bluntly. The three humans exchanged another, one of those complex glances before Dr. Webb activated a second display. This one showed human military organization charts, training statistics, and capability assessments that had never been shared with galactic intelligence services. The numbers were staggering. Our total population is approximately 12 billion across all colonies and stations, Ambassador Kim began. Of those, roughly 2 billion serve in active military roles at any given time, with another 4 billion maintaining reserve status that allows for rapid mobilization. 6 billion soldiers, Veltar whispered, his chromatophore patches cycling through colors that indicated profound shock. 6 billion trained combatants, Sarah corrected. Not all of them are soldiers in the traditional sense. Many are engineers, technicians, logistical specialists, medical personnel, and other support roles. But all of them can fight if necessary. The implications were overwhelming. Most galactic civilizations maintained military forces that numbered in the millions at most, with the largest warrior cultures fielding perhaps a few 100 million combatants. The idea of a species with billions of trained fighters was beyond anything in recorded galactic history. Your technology, Veltar said desperately, grasping for some framework that could explain what he was learning. Your weapons, your ships, your defensive systems, are they equally superior to what you've revealed in previous assessments? Our technology is exactly what we've said it is, Dr. Webb replied. Efficient, reliable, but not dramatically advanced compared to galactic standards. We've never claimed technological superiority because we don't need it. You don't need it because your people are the weapons, Veltar said, understanding beginning to dawn. We prefer to think of it as humans being the most important component of any military system, Ambassador Kim said diplomatically. Technology can fail, can be countered, can be stolen or duplicated. But trained, motivated, adaptable personnel are irreplaceable. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed but somehow still containing that sense of coiled readiness that Veltar was beginning to recognize as characteristically human. Most species develop advanced weapons to compensate for biological limitations. Humans developed advanced humans instead. But why hide this? Why maintain the pretense of being a minor power when you clearly represent one of the most formidable military forces in the galaxy? Because, Ambassador Kim said patiently, we learned from our own history that being perceived as a threat often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When other powers believe you're planning to attack them, they attack you first to gain the advantage. We've found that being underestimated is much safer than being feared. Until now, Veltar observed. Until now, Sarah agreed. But recent events have suggested that our cautious approach may have outlived its usefulness. Some species have begun to interpret our restraint as weakness rather than choice, and that's leading to situations that could escalate beyond diplomatic solutions. Veltar's mind raced through the implications. If humans had been deliberately concealing their true capabilities, then every territorial negotiation, every trade agreement, Every diplomatic protocol that had been established since first contact was based on false assumptions. The balance of power that had maintained galactic stability for decades was built on a foundation of incomplete information. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "What is the purpose of this revelation?" "We want what we've always wanted," Ambassador Kim replied. "Peaceful coexistence, mutually beneficial trade relationships, and cooperative exploration of the galaxy. But we want those things based on accurate understanding rather than misconceptions. We're tired of being dismissed," Dr. All, Webb added. "Tired of having our legitimate interests ignored because other species assume we lack the capability to enforce them. Tired of watching aggressive powers expand their territories because they believe humans won't fight to protect our own." Sarah's smile was sharp. "We're offering a reset, Ambassador, a chance to rebuild galactic relationships based on honest assessment of capabilities rather than assumptions based on limited data. And if the galaxy refuses this offer, then the galaxy will learn about human capabilities through experience rather than demonstration," Sarah said simply. "We'd prefer to avoid that, but we're prepared for it if necessary." The threat was delivered so casually, so matter-of-factly, that it took Veltar several seconds to fully process it. Here were three humans, sitting calmly in a diplomatic meeting chamber, politely explaining that their species possessed the capability to reshape galactic civilization through military force and was willing to use it if their peaceful overtures were rejected. "You're not asking for new territorial concessions," he said, reviewing his notes. "You're not demanding revised trade agreements or enhanced diplomatic status. What exactly are you asking for?" "Respect," Ambassador Kim said simply. "Recognition that humanity is a major power that should be consulted on decisions that affect galactic stability. An end to the casual dismissal of human interests in territorial negotiations. A seat at the table when important decisions are made. And in return, we continue to be the peaceful, cooperative neighbors we've always been," Dr. Webb replied. "We continue to prefer negotiation to force, cooperation to conquest, but we do so from a position of acknowledged strength rather than perceived weakness." Veltar realized that he was witnessing a pivotal moment in galactic history. The humans weren't demanding anything unreasonable. They were simply asking to be treated as equals rather than as a minor power that could be safely ignored. But they were backing that request with the revelation that they possessed the military capability to enforce it if necessary. It was, he had to admit, a remarkably sophisticated approach to diplomatic leverage. Rather than building up their forces in secret and revealing them through aggressive action, they had demonstrated their capabilities in a controlled environment while simultaneously offering to continue their peaceful policies. They were giving the galaxy a choice: accept humans as equals based on demonstrated capability, or discover the full extent of human military power through less pleasant means.
"I will need to convey this information to the Hegemony Council," Veltar said finally.
"Of course," Ambassador Kim replied. "We understand that this represents a significant shift in how humanity is perceived, and that adjustment will take time."
"How much time?" Veltar asked.
Sarah's smile was not entirely reassuring. "As much time as it takes, Ambassador. But we hope not too much. Patience, after all, is not infinite even for humans." As Ambassador Veltar departed the human quarters, his mind was already racing through the complex calculations required to adjust galactic policy for the new reality of human capability. Behind him, the three humans settled back into their chairs to wait for the inevitable response from a galaxy that was about to learn that the quiet neighbors from the outer rim had been concealing the fact that they were possibly the most dangerous species in known space. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time in galactic history, it was shifting in favor of a species that claimed they didn't want to use it. 6 months after the exhibition that changed everything, Commander Zethkar stood once again in the Grand Colosseum, but this time he wasn't there as a competitor. The Krillian Empire's most decorated warrior now served as a military attaché to the newly formed Galactic Defense Coordination Council, a position that would have been unthinkable before the galaxy learned the truth about human capabilities. The arena below was hosting a very different kind of exhibition today. Instead of ritualized combat between individual warriors, the floor had been converted into a training demonstration area where human military instructors were teaching mixed-species units the fundamentals of what had come to be known as adaptive combat doctrine. The irony was not lost on Zethkar. 6 months ago, he had mocked the idea of humans fighting without weapons. Now warriors from across the galaxy were traveling to human space to learn techniques that could make any combatant more effective regardless of their natural abilities or technological advantages. The student had become the teacher, and the teacher was remarkably generous with their knowledge. "Commander Zethkar," came a familiar voice behind him. He turned to see Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen approaching, though her title had changed since their first meeting. She now held the position of Director of Interspecies Combat Training, a role that had been created specifically to manage the flood of requests for human military instruction. Director Chen, he replied, still struggling with the protocol adjustments required by humanity's new status in galactic affairs. I trust today's demonstration will be as educational as our previous encounters. Sarah's smile was genuinely warm, lacking the sharp edges it had carried during their first meeting.
I certainly hope so.
Today's focus is on tactical adaptation, how to modify traditional combat techniques when facing opponents with unknown capabilities. In the arena below, a mixed unit of Kresh, Vorthak, Thoraxian, and human soldiers was working through a complex training exercise. The scenario involved neutralizing an opponent whose abilities were intentionally kept secret from the attacking team, forcing them to adapt their strategies in real time based on observed capabilities rather than assumed limitations. Zethkar watched with professional interest as the mixed team encountered their first obstacle, a defensive position that couldn't be overcome using standard tactics for any single species. The Kresh warriors' natural aggressiveness was being tempered by input from Vorthak heavy fighters, who excelled at siege warfare, while Thoraxian berserkers provided rapid assault capabilities and human advisors offered strategic coordination. 6 months ago, that kind of cooperation would have been impossible, Zethkar observed. Each species would have insisted on using their traditional methods, and they would have failed, Sarah agreed. The human approach isn't about replacing traditional methods. It's about recognizing when traditional methods aren't sufficient and adapting accordingly. The training exercise below provided a perfect example. The defensive position had been designed to counter each species' primary combat doctrine, making it impossible for any single approach to succeed. But the mixed team was learning to combine their different capabilities in ways that created new tactical options none of them could achieve alone. Is this why you revealed your true capabilities? Zethkar asked. To teach the galaxy to fight more effectively? Sarah shook her head. We revealed our capabilities because hiding them was becoming counterproductive. But teaching others to fight more effectively serves multiple purposes, such as, if everyone in the galaxy understands how to adapt their tactics to counter unknown threats, then no single species can maintain a decisive advantage based on concealed capabilities, Sarah explained. It creates a more stable strategic environment where conflicts are less likely to escalate beyond diplomatic solutions. The logic was typically human, simultaneously idealistic and practical. By sharing their combat knowledge, humans were reducing their own tactical advantages while increasing overall galactic military effectiveness. It was the kind of long-term thinking that most warrior cultures found difficult to understand, but had learned to respect. In the arena, the mixed team had successfully adapted their approach and was making progress against the defensive position. Zethkar noticed that the human advisors were playing increasingly minor roles as the alien warriors learned to apply adaptive principles themselves. Rather than maintaining their instructional advantage, the humans seemed genuinely focused on making their students independent of human guidance. The council meeting this afternoon, Zethkar said, changing the subject to the reason for his visit. The hegemony is planning to propose expanded human involvement in the Outer Rim security protocols. I know, Sarah replied. Ambassador Kim briefed me yesterday. What's your assessment of the proposal's chances? Zethkar considered the question carefully. The political landscape had shifted dramatically since humans had revealed their true capabilities, but not always in predictable ways. Some species had embraced the new reality and were actively seeking closer cooperation with humanity. Others were still struggling to adjust their policies and assumptions. A few had withdrawn from galactic affairs entirely, apparently unwilling to operate in an environment where their previous advantages no longer applied. The warrior cultures will support it, he said finally. We've learned to appreciate the value of human strategic thinking and tactical innovation. The trade federations will likely support it as well, since human protection makes their shipping routes more secure and predictable. And the holdouts? The Hegemony Council itself is divided. Some members see human involvement as essential for maintaining galactic stability. Others worry that increased human influence will eventually lead to human dominance. Sarah's expression grew more serious. And what do you think, Commander? Are their concerns justified? It was a question that Zethkar had been pondering for months. Human military capability was undeniable, but their demonstrated restraint was equally impressive. In the 6 months since the revelation, humans could have pressed for significant advantages in territorial negotiations, trade agreements, and resource allocations. Instead, they had continued their measured approach to galactic affairs, asking for respect rather than submission and offering cooperation rather than demanding tribute. I think, he said slowly, that humans are perhaps the only species in the galaxy that could achieve dominance and choose not to exercise it. That may be the most frightening thing about your people. Frightening. A warrior who wins through superior strength is predictable, Sethkar explained. You know they will continue to use that strength to get what they want. A warrior who wins through superior strategy is also predictable. They will continue to outthink their opponents. But a warrior who could win and chooses not to? That level of self-control is unsettling to most predatory species.
Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I can understand that.
But consider the alternative. Would the galaxy be more stable if humans pursued dominance rather than cooperation? No. Zethkar admitted immediately. The galaxy would probably be at war within a year if humans decided to pursue aggressive expansion. Your species' combination of tactical adaptability and strategic patience would make you nearly impossible to defeat in a prolonged conflict. Then perhaps our restraint isn't so frightening after all? Perhaps not frightening, Sethkar agreed, but definitely humbling. In the arena below, the training exercise had concluded successfully. The mixed team had not only overcome the defensive position, but had done so using tactics that none of their individual species could have developed alone. The human instructors were conducting a detailed debrief, helping the participants understand how their adaptive approach could be applied to other scenarios. There's something else I wanted to discuss, Zethkar said, his tone becoming more formal. The Krillian Empire has been authorized to make a formal request. What kind of request? We want to establish a permanent exchange program with human military forces. Krillian warriors would serve alongside human units, while human advisors would be embedded with Krillian formations. The goal would be mutual learning and improved tactical coordination. Sarah raised an eyebrow. That's a significant step for the Empire. 6 months ago, you considered humans to be weak and technologically dependent. 6 months ago, we were fools operating on incomplete information, Zethkar said bluntly. Now we know better. The question is whether humans are willing to share their knowledge with former skeptics. The answer to that depends on the Krillian Empire's long-term intentions, Sarah replied carefully. Are you seeking to improve your military effectiveness for defensive purposes? Or are you planning new territorial expansions? It was exactly the kind of question that demonstrated why humans had become so influential in galactic affairs. They didn't just consider immediate tactical advantages. They thought about long-term strategic implications and the broader impact of their decisions on galactic stability. Defensive purposes, Zethkar assured her. The Empire has reconsidered its expansion policies in light of recent revelations. We now believe that sustainable security comes from strong alliances rather than conquered territories. That's a significant philosophical shift for a warrior culture. Humans have taught us that there's a difference between being strong and needing to prove it, Zethkar said. The Empire's learning to be confident in its capabilities without feeling compelled to demonstrate them through conquest. Sarah smiled, and this time it was entirely genuine. I'll recommend approval of the exchange program to the Defense Coordination Council. I think it could be mutually beneficial. As they spoke, a new group of trainees was entering the arena for the afternoon session. This group included representatives from some of the more cautious species who had initially been reluctant to acknowledge human capabilities. Their presence indicated that even the holdouts were beginning to recognize the value of adaptive combat training. The galaxy is changing, Zethkar observed, watching the diverse group of warriors prepare for their instruction. The galaxy is learning, Sarah corrected. Learning that diversity of capabilities is a strength rather than a weakness, that cooperation can achieve more than competition, and that true strength comes from choosing when not to use force rather than simply possessing it. And if some species refuse to learn those lessons, Sarah's expression grew more serious, then they'll discover that the galaxy has moved beyond the old paradigms of conquest and domination. Species that can't adapt to cooperative frameworks will find themselves increasingly isolated and eventually irrelevant. It wasn't a threat, Zethkar realized. It was simply an observation about the natural evolution of galactic civilization. Humans hadn't imposed their values on other species. They had demonstrated that those values were more effective than traditional approaches, and other species were choosing to adopt them voluntarily. Speaking of adaptation, Sarah said, checking her chronometer, I should prepare for this afternoon's council session. The discussion about Outer Rim security protocols will require careful handling. Any particular concerns? The usual ones. Some council members are still uncomfortable with the idea of human forces operating independently in contested regions. They prefer the old system where each species handled security within their own territories. Even though the old system was clearly failing? Sarah shrugged. Change is difficult, especially for species that built their identities around military superiority. Acknowledging that humans might be better suited for certain types of conflicts requires them to reconsider fundamental assumptions about their place in the galactic hierarchy. Zethkar understood the problem. The revelation of human capabilities hadn't just changed military strategies, it had forced every species in the galaxy to reevaluate their self-perception and their relationships with other civilizations. For warrior cultures like his own, the adjustment had been particularly difficult. The hegemony fears that human involvement in Outer Rim security will lead to human territorial expansion, he said. And what do you think about that concern? I think the hegemony doesn't understand human psychology, Zethkar replied. Humans could have claimed vast territories in the Outer Rim years ago if territorial expansion was their goal. The fact that they haven't suggests that their motivations are different from what most species assume. Different how? Humans seem to view territory as a tool rather than a goal, Zethkar said, working through his thoughts aloud. You expand when expansion serves your purposes, but you don't expand simply for the sake of having more territory. It's pragmatic rather than emotional. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's a very insightful observation, Commander. Most species either expand aggressively because they equate territory with power, or they remain static because they fear the complications of expansion. Humans tend to expand strategically, claiming territory that serves specific purposes while avoiding regions that would create more problems than they solve, which is why human territorial claims are scattered rather than consolidated. Exactly. We establish bases and outposts where they're needed for trade protection, scientific research, or defensive coordination. But we don't try to create vast contiguous empires. That approach offers strategic flexibility without the administrative burden of governing unwilling populations. It was, Zethkar reflected, yet another example of the practical intelligence that had made humans so successful despite their delayed entry into galactic affairs. While other species focused on traditional metrics of power and prestige, humans consistently chose approaches that achieved their actual objectives with minimum unnecessary complexity. In the arena below, the afternoon training session was beginning. This group included several species that Zethkar recognized as being particularly resistant to change, which made their presence here especially significant. The fact that even the most conservative military cultures were seeking human instruction indicated just how thoroughly the old paradigms had been overturned. Commander, Sarah said as she prepared to leave for the council session, I want you to know that the Krillian Empire's willingness to embrace adaptive strategies has been noticed and appreciated. Your species' example has made it easier for other warrior cultures to accept that learning from humans doesn't represent weakness or submission. The Empire has learned that pride can be expensive, Zethkar replied. Better to swallow our pride and improve our capabilities than to maintain our arrogance and lose our effectiveness. That lesson applies to more than just military affairs, Sarah observed. The species that adapt to the new galactic environment will thrive. Those that refuse to change will find themselves increasingly marginalized. As Sarah departed for her council obligations, Zethkar remained in the viewing area to observe the training session. The exercises he watched would have been impossible 6 months earlier, not because of technological limitations, but because of the psychological barriers that had prevented different species from truly cooperating. The human revelation had done more than demonstrate superior combat capabilities. It had shattered the comfortable assumptions that had kept galactic civilization locked in patterns of competition and mistrust. By proving that apparent weakness could conceal actual strength, humans had forced every species to reconsider what they thought they knew about themselves and their neighbors. The result was a galaxy in transition, moving away from the old paradigms of conquest and domination towards something more complex and potentially more stable. It wasn't a peaceful transition, change never was, but it was a necessary one. The old ways had been leading toward larger and more destructive conflicts as species competed for resources and territory in an increasingly crowded galaxy. Now, with humans providing both the military capability and the strategic vision to maintain stability, there was a possibility of achieving something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization based on cooperation rather than competition, where conflicts were resolved through negotiation backed by overwhelming but restrained force. The key word was restrained. Humans had demonstrated that they possessed the military capability to dominate the galaxy if they chose to, but they had also demonstrated that they would rather build a stable, cooperative civilization than rule over a chaotic, resistant one. That combination of capability and restraint was what made them uniquely suited to serve as the galaxy's stabilizing force. As the training session continued below, Zethkar reflected on how much his own perspective had changed. 6 months ago, he had been a proud Krillian warrior who viewed humans as weak and technologically dependent. Now he was a student of human strategic thinking, learning lessons that were making his own people more effective and more secure. The transformation hadn't been easy. Accepting that humans were superior in most aspects of military science had required him to abandon cherished beliefs about Krillian superiority and natural dominance. But the results spoke for themselves. Krillian forces that had trained with human advisors were more effective, more adaptable, and more successful than traditional units. More importantly, they were part of something larger than the Empire's individual interests. The cooperative frameworks that humans had established were creating opportunities for mutual benefit that had never existed under the old competitive paradigms. Krillian warriors were learning from human tacticians. Human engineers were adapting Krillian technologies, and both species were contributing to galactic security initiatives that protected everyone's interests. It was, Zethkar realized, exactly what humans had promised from the beginning. They had offered partnership rather than dominance, cooperation rather than conquest, and they had delivered on those promises even after revealing that they could have chosen otherwise. The afternoon training session concluded with a joint exercise that would have been unthinkable under the old paradigms. Warriors from 6 different species working together as a single coordinated unit, their individual strengths enhanced by collective tactical intelligence rather than diminished by competitive rivalry. As the participants gathered for their debrief, Zethkar could see the future of galactic civilization taking shape. It would be a future where diversity was valued rather than feared, where cooperation was seen as strength rather than weakness, and where conflicts were resolved through overwhelming deterrence rather than devastating warfare. And at the center of it all would be humanity, the species that had chosen to be the galaxy's stabilizing force, not because they were forced to, but because they understood that their own security and prosperity of their neighbors. It was, Zethkar thought, the most human approach possible to galactic dominance, achieving it by making it unnecessary. The exhibition that had begun with his mockery of human weakness had evolved into something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. It had become the catalyst for a fundamental transformation of galactic civilization, proving that sometimes the most important victories were won not through superior force, but through superior wisdom. And in a galaxy that was finally learning to value wisdom over strength, humans had found their true place, not as conquerors, but as teachers, protectors, and the living proof that the strongest species was often the one that chose not to prove it. As Zethkar left the arena to prepare his own reports for the Krillian High Command, he reflected on the simple truth that had emerged from 6 months of revelation and adjustment. The galaxy had been searching for a species strong enough to maintain peace, and they had found 1 to 11. They just hadn't recognized it until a small human female raised her hand and changed everything. The future would bring new challenges and new opportunities for growth. But for the first time in galactic history, there was genuine reason to believe that those challenges could be met through cooperation rather than conquest. And that, more than any military victory or territorial expansion, represented the true measure of human success. The species that had been mocked for fighting without weapons had taught the galaxy that the most powerful weapon of all was the wisdom to know when not to fight.